Today we're going to be learning Beitzah Daf Tet. Today's daf is sponsored by Elimelech and Marina Leibowitz in honor of Zissi Turner Berkowitz on becoming a Yoetzet Halakha. May all your decisions be strong and with love. Okay, Mazal Tov. And Gmar Chatima Tova to everyone. Wishing everyone a good fast for today. And may it be a meaningful week. And I hope that you enjoyed the 2 days of Rosh Hashanah and having a new understanding of the different opinions, the Shechianus that we said, and all the customs of the new fruit and the new clothes and everything else. Okay. We're going to start at the bottom of our page of the bottom of yesterday's daf, the last line. Amal Rabba. Shachat sipur me'erev Yom Tov ein mechasino to b'Yom Tov. If you recall, we're in the middle of the sugya still about kisoi hadam, covering the blood. So comes Rabba and he said, Rabbi says, if you slaughter the bird, in other words, in the cases where we allow it, remember, even Beit Hillel says that if you already slaughtered it, we can cover the blood. That's only if you slaughtered it today on Yantif. But if you slaughtered it yesterday and you just didn't take care of covering the blood, we do not let you take care of it on Yantif. Okay, that's not allowed. This, by the way, falls into a category of all sorts of things that we don't allow if you could have done it yesterday. If you just pushed it off. So on Yantif, we allow you to do all sorts of things that maybe you could have done yesterday because if it'll be fresher, we want you, right? Food always tastes better. Right? You can tell me, you ate, depending on whether you cook on Yantif or don't cook on Yantif, whether you ate food yesterday that was cooked 2 days before, right? It's not as fresh if you do that. So that's why we allow cooking on Yantif so that you can eat very fresh food. But if you did it anyway yesterday and it's less fresh, right? Then you should have covered the blood yesterday and therefore we don't permit it on Yantif. However, says Rava though, Gilgel Isame Erev Yom Tov. But if you needed your dough on Erev Yom Tov, Mafrish Mimena Chalata B'Yom Tov. You can even take challah. Okay, challah is the part that you're supposed to take out and give to the Kohen. You can even take that portion on Yom Tov. Okay, so now we have to go back to a little bit of background. What's the problem with taking challah on Yom Tov? It's the same problem as taking Trumot and Maslot, theoretically. Trumot and Maslot, you're not allowed to take on Shabbos or on Yantif. Why is that? We've talked about it many times. It's because you're mitaken kli. You're basically fixing the fruits. You can't eat them, fruits, vegetables, whatever they are. You can't eat them unless you take the Trumot and Maslot. Until then, they're forbidden to eat. So by you taking the Trumot and Maslot, you're in effect fixing them, right? That's one possibility. So, or it's the main possibility. The question is, why would Rabbi then say it's okay? So comes Rabbi and he says, listen, I'm going to distinguish between Trumot and Maslot and challah. Why is that? Trumot and Maslot, do you ever have a situation where you could have done it on Yom Tov, halachically? No, because you're always in a situation where you could have done it yesterday, because when you obligate in Trumot and Maslot, when you pick them off a tree, now you can't pick them off the tree or cut them from the ground, can't do that on Yom Tov. So you'll never have a situation where because of Yom Tov, you only became obligated, because you were allowed to do something on Yom Tov, you only became obligated to do it now. That's not true. Okay, even though we say ochal nefesh, we don't allow it from the time of picking. We only allow it, and there's a machloket about when we allow it. Is it only from the kneading point, or is it maybe a little bit earlier in the process? But nobody thinks it's from the time when you cut it. So now, if comes Rabba and he says, however, challah is different. I can make a dough on Yantif, and then I'll only be obligated now. Maybe even if you say I did the early stages, but the kneading for sure is allowed to be done on Yom Tov. And you're really only obligated in challah once you knead the dough. So if that's the case, then clearly I can be mafresh challah on Yom Tov. In that case, we're going to allow me, even if it wasn't a case where I made the dough on Yantif, I made it before Yantif, but we're going to allow me to do it. Now, theoretically, you should say it's just like kisoi adam. So why doesn't kisoi adam also? You could have done the shechita before, but you also could have done it on Yantif. And if you did it on Yantif, you'd be allowed to cover the blood. So now you'd have to say, in other words, first we have to understand why he makes a distinction between afrashat challah and Trumot and Maslot, the regular, in fruits and vegetables. That's because they're never permitted, because you'll never have a situation where you had to do it, where you did it on Yantif. But challah, since you can do it on Yantif, therefore we allow it even before Yantif. Why not with shechita? So that's because there's more of a halachic issue involved. Like there's more of a tircha, it's a bigger effort to make on Yantif, whereas to just be mafresh challah is very easy to do on Yantif, and therefore he's going to allow it on Yom Tov. However, Avoid Shmuel, the father of Shmuel, says, no, they're the same basically. Afilu gilgel isame erev Yom Tov, em mafresh mimena chalata b'Yom Tov. No, he's going to say, just like we don't allow you to cover the blood. Well, what's the difference? You should have done it before Yantif. Likewise, you should have done. It's true. You can be mafresh challah today if you made the dough today, but you didn't make the dough today. You made it yesterday. So he didn't allow this. Now the Gemara wants to bring up Shmuel and question Shmuel based on Avua de Shmuel. Avua de Shmuel is Shmuel's father. Okay, he was known as Shmuel's father, obviously because Shmuel was such a great scholar that his father became known as his father. So now we're going to suggest Lema Pliga de Shmuel ada Avua. Does Shmuel really disagree with his father? It's a question, right? Like we'd always want to basically say that if we could, that people might probably hold like their fathers. So let's say, are we going to say that Shmuel really disagrees with his father? And I see it here asking about this makebe patish, about why is it not putting on the final blow? We're going to see now another difference between challah and truma damaskot. So Shmuel says, to Amar Shmuel, chalat chutz ha'la'aretz. Now we happen to be talking about challah outside of Israel. Challah outside of Israel, we also do challah outside of Israel, even though we don't do truma damaskot outside of Israel. But why do we do it outside of Israel? So it's only midrabbanan. The rabbis decreed, even though it's one of these mitzvot that are tluyot ba'aretz, the rabbis decreed that we're going to do it also outside of Israel. So he's talking only about that, but we're going to assume that when the father of Shmuel talked about hafrashat challah, and he didn't say specifically in Israel, we're going to assume he meant also abroad, okay, also in the diaspora. So chalat chutz la'aretz, ochel v'holech, v'achar kach mafrish. Okay, this is going to answer your question, Gita. Why is this not considered makebe patish? Okay, why is it another reason besides it's different from truma d'masrot in the sense that that challah for sure can be done in Yom Tov in the event. The first thing is if we're going to allow you to make a dough on Yom Tov, then obviously we're going to allow you to be mafresh challah because otherwise, how are you going to eat? How are you going to do it? Like we always have to, when you make a dough, you always have to take out challah. So obviously it must be allowed in Yom Tov, and therefore we'll allow it even if you, right, according to the first opinion, Rabbah, even if you made your dough before Yom Tov. Came Avua de Shmuel, and he said, listen, if you did it on Yantif, it's okay, but if you did it on Erev Yantif, we're not going to allow it. So now we're going to assume that Shmuel must disagree with his father. Why? Because Shmuel says, it's not the same as Truma d'Masrot. Truma d'Masrot, you can't eat. It's called tevel. Remember this? It's called tevel until you tithe the produce. If you don't take the tithes, it's forbidden food. You cannot eat it, which means that the act of taking the truma d'Masrot and giving it to the Kohen and separating it out and saying, I'll give this to the Kohen, I'll give this to the Levi, etc., that permits the food to be eaten. That's why it's what we call makebe patish. But Shmuel says, at least in chutz la'aretz, where it's only d'Rabbanan, you can be ochel v'holech v'achar kach mafrish. You can eat your bread even if you didn't take challah. And then you can just leave over a piece at the end, meaning it doesn't fix. It's not a fixing kind of thing. It doesn't fix the loaf. Well, if it doesn't fix the loaf, then there should be nothing wrong with it on Yantif. To which the Gemara says, it must be Shmuel disagrees with his father. Because if his father doesn't permit it, it must be. His father views it as you're fixing it. You can't eat it without doing that. And Shmuel clearly says that's not the case. So now Rav is going to answer our question, saying, no, you're missing the point. There's really two issues. And Shmuel's father is not worried about fixing the fruits. Like, we'll say everyone will agree, at least in chutz la'aretz, that it doesn't fix the fruits, in which case that's why another reason why we can be lenient on Yantif. But Amar Rava, why is the father of Shmuel then strict and doesn't allow it if you could have done it yesterday? Milo modeh Shmuel. And then we're going to assume Shmuel must agree with his father that you can't do it, even though you're actually not fixing the loaf. Milo modeh Shmuel, does he not agree though? She'im kara aleh Hashem she'asura lezarim. Does Shmuel not admit though that if you did call it challah, let's say, okay, so it's true Shmuel says you could just leave it over at the end and only at the end take it. That's fine. However, if you did say this is challah, then wouldn't Shmuel agree that it's forbidden at that point to non-Kohanim? Okay, so what? Right, the Gemara, we're going to see this more than once today, but the Gemara doesn't explain well enough what the next step is. The next step is, again, because whenever the Gemara doesn't explain the next step, there's different opinions about what the next step is, but I'll explain it in one way. That if you can say, this is challah, and then it becomes immediately forbidden to you, and only Kohanim can eat it. Right nowadays, we burn it because we don't give it to Kohanim, etc. I'm not going to get into that right now, but in those days, they would give it to a Kohen, and it was forbidden, right? No, even today, right? We can't eat it. So since that's the case, that in and of itself is not something you could do on Yom Tov. Now, why is that? Okay. In other words, if you had the opportunity to do it yesterday. So why is that? So the assumption is, again, one of the explanations is, what does it mean to make something forbidden to someone else, right? It's basically like sanctifying something, right? You can call something cherem, for example, and then it's property of the Kohen. You're basically saying, I'm giving this to the temple and it's for use for the Kohanim. Or you can say it's hekdesh, it's for God. Now, you're not allowed to do that on Yom Tov either. It's almost like it seems like a business dealing. You're basically changing the status of something, right? The ownership of it. So because of that, Shmuel won't allow it. So basically, we're saying that Shmuel does agree with his father that if you could have done it before Yom Tov, you can't, because there's two elements. One is you're fixing it. So he doesn't think you're fixing it because he thinks you can eat it even without fixing it. But he does think that you're changing the status of this food, and that is like making something sanctified, but you're also not allowed to do on Yom Tov. And that's the problem with Truma, with Challah on Yom Tov. Okay, so again, we saw two opinions. Rabbah, who said, you're allowed to do challah. You just can't do kisoy adam if you slaughtered it yesterday, right? And if you made the dough yesterday, you could do challah. Whereas Shmuel's father, and seemingly, at least according to the Gemara's conclusion, Shmuel probably agrees with his father, who says that you can't do it even on Yom Tov, okay? Unless, of course, you made the dough that day. If you made the dough, then we're going to allow it. And that's because, and we're going to see this over and over, because of Simchat Yom Tov, and we want you to be able to have fresh food, we permit all sorts of things that maybe could be forbidden in a different way, but we're going to permit them on Yom Tov. Okay, so now with that topic, we're going to move on with that in mind, this idea about Simchat Yom Tov, we're going to move on to the next Mishnah. Beit Shammai omrim, ein molichim et hasulam mishavach l'shavach. You can't move your ladder from dovecote to dovecote. If you want some background on doves and pigeons in the time of the Gemara, you can read Shuli Mishkat's article that just went up on our site on Flashback about doves and pigeons. So we're assuming you have this dovecote, okay, whether it's yours or someone else's, right? We're going to see, we're talking about in public, in private, etc. We'll get to all that later. And I'll just remind you that Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel were, Hillel and Shammai for sure were early Tanaim, and even Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel are earlier in the Tanaitic time period. And we're going to see, because when you have earlier machloket, often there are debates about what exactly the machloket was about. And later Tanaim and also Amoraim are going to have debates about which case were they debating. It's not so clear. So Beit Shammai says, you can't, now the dovecotes were tall, so how would you get there? With a ladder. The other thing that was tall in those days was your second floor of your house. And there were also ladders that would get you to either the second house or to the roof. Okay, so there were these ladders. And we're going to see that, at least according to the Bavli and according to Beitzah, we're going to see there were ladders that you used for one and a different ladder that you used for the other. So you got to your roof generally using one type ladder, and you got to your dovecote using a different type ladder. So Beit Shammai says you cannot move a ladder from dovecote to dovecote. Now, why are you going to the dovecotes? Because you want to find a dove in order to slaughter to eat on Yom Tov. So you're not allowed to move from dovecote to dovecote in order to get a bird. Aval, mateu mechalon lechalon. But what can you do? There are different windows in the dovecote, right? Imagine a birdhouse, right? With a little opening for the bird. So you can move it, could kind of, where you probably wouldn't move the bottom of the ladder. All you do is move the top part from one part of the dovecote to another part. That's allowed, but you can't move from one dovecote to another. Beit Hillel matirim. Beit Hillel says we have no problem with any of this. You can move it from one to another, no problem. Okay, that's our first simple reading of the Mishnah. What is the issue in the Mishnah? So before we even get to what the Bavli says, I'll point out that Safrai in Mishnah Eretz Yisrael claims that the Bavli takes it in one direction, and it's not necessarily the case in that was really the machloket. Okay, he claims that maybe it's all a muktzah issue. In other words, that maybe you have a ladder that these birds, and we're going to see this from the upcoming Mishnah, they have to be designated in some way beforehand. So if you have your ladder leaning up against a dovecote and you want to now move it to a different dovecote, well, that means that you must have left the ladder there from yesterday because you wanted to get to that dovecote. And then the question is, are you allowed to move it to another one, even if it wasn't designated before? And maybe that's part of the issue. But that's not the way the Bavli seems to understand the machloket. And we're going to see right now. We're going to have the structure for the next section is two different versions of how Rav Hanan ben Ami or Bar Ami learns the machloket. Okay, two different versions of the same person. So I'm a Rav Hanan bar Ami. We're in the first version, and I charted this out on the sheet to help make it easier. Machloket b'reshut harabim. The debate between them is only a dovecote that's in the public domain. Then Beit Shammai says no, and Beit Hillel says yes. Why? Beit Shammai savre haro'eh omer. If it's in public, what's the concern? Somebody will see you doing it. If they see you moving your ladder, they won't see that you're moving it from dovecote to dovecote. They'll just see you schlepping a ladder. And what are they going to think? They're going to think that you're bringing it up to your roof. As I said, there's ladders. You would use ladders to get up to your roof. You would use ladders to get to your dovecotes. They're going to see you moving a ladder. They're not going to know why you're moving it. Right? At this point, we don't get into the discussion yet. Which type of ladder was he moving? We're going to see. But someone's going to see you moving it and think that you're going to plaster your roof. And what are they going to think? So again, always question, what is Marat Ayin really? Someone will see you doing it. Maybe they'll think it's permitted. Right? You have to remember, all sorts of things on Yom Tov were permitted that weren't permitted on Shabbat. So people might think, oh, maybe it's okay to plaster your roof. Or maybe people will just think you're a bad person doing, things you're not allowed to do, and they'll start bad-mouthing you. Maybe that's part of the issue. So we don't want anyone coming to a wrong conclusion. Therefore, don't do it in public. But in private, who cares, right? It's fine. No one's going to see you. Now, the way some people explain shovacho mochiach halav is which ladder you're using will make it clear, okay? Which means you're using a ladder that was used for dovecotes. Nobody's going to think that you're going to put that use it for your roof, right? Now, you can see why maybe there would be a debate about that, because it's true that I might have a special ladder designated for this and a special ladder designated for that, but, it could be that my ladder's not there right now. Someone took it and I'll use my other ladder. I don't know how different they were also. It's hard to know the reality. So he says, it's clear that you're going to the Shavach. We're not worried about Marat Ayin. Okay, so what you see here is the Bavli takes it to a place of Marat Ayin, not having anything to do with things being prepared before, like the Beitzah Shenolda or something like that. Even though the next Mishnah about doves, which we're going to see tomorrow, although we're going to start quoting it today, it's going to be quoted in our Gemara later, has to do with designating the birds before. So here it seems like an all Marat Ayin issue, to which the Gemara questions. It says, wait a minute, right? One more line before we get to the question. Aval, right? If he says the machloket's in the public domain, he says that in the private domain, nobody thinks it's a problem. In the public domain, Beit Shammai is worried about Marat Ayin, and Beit Hillel is not worried about that at all. He thinks it's quite clear what your purpose is. Maybe he thinks because you're moving it from dovecote to dovecote, it should be obvious. It's not like someone's going to see you in the middle, not knowing where you're going, but it'll be obvious. Aval, okay, so but Reshut Echid, everyone's going to permit. So now the Gemara questions, it says, Ini, but wait a minute. This doesn't match what Rav Yehuda says in the name of Rav. V'ha amar Rav Yehuda amar Rav. It's a very famous halacha. Rav says, if something is permitted in public because somebody might come to the wrong conclusion, it's even forbidden in chedrei chadarim, in a room inside a room inside a room, right? Where no one's going to see you, it's still forbidden. Why is this? Well, maybe if you're forbidden in the room, you'll permit it in the room. People will think you could do it outside, right? Or maybe somehow somebody will see you. Seems to be a concern. Rav forbids this. So the question is, how can Rav Hanan bar Ami explain Beit Shammai as saying you can do it in private, you just can't do it in public, when Rav says that? And basically, we're going to say Rav Hanan can't possibly be right because he's going against Rav. Now, it's a little bit weird because an Amora can disagree with an Amora, but maybe not a big Amora like Rav, right? Rav was basically the Rav of the generation, and it seems odd that he would disagree with Rav. To which the Gemara answers, oh, don't worry about that. Tanaihi. There's a machloket tanaim about this principle of Rav. In other words, whenever you ask a question against someone, how could you say this if so-and-so said it? Well, if you have a Tanaitic source to rely on, then you can rely on that Tanaitic source. So the answer is basically Rav Hanan bar Ami relies on one Tana and Rav relies on a different Tana, and therefore it's okay that they debate. And that's going to be the conclusion here of the first reading. So let's read it inside. How do we know it's a debate among Tanaim about whether things that are forbidden in public because of Marit Ha'ayin are also forbidden in private. So here's your machloket. If you get your clothes soaking wet on Yantif, you got stuck in the rain and your clothes were dripping wet, happened to me once on Yantif actually. I'm trying to remember if this is Shabbat or Yantif, it really shouldn't matter. It would be Yantif or Shabbat. You get soaked and you want to hang up your clothes to dry. What's the problem? If you hang up your clothes to dry, people will think that you did your laundry on Shabbos or Yantif. So it says here, according to Tanakama, you can hang them in the sun, but not in a place where it's public and people can see you. Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Shimon oslim, but Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Shimon forbid. Okay, so you see this is machloket, exactly Rav Chanan bar Ami, who says, no, Beit Shammai permits it in private, just not in public. Versus Rav, who says, no, if it's forbidden in public, it's also forbidden in private. And here you see the two opinions. It's a debate between Tanaim, and therefore each one matches up with a different Tana, and then it's okay. That's the first version of Rav Chanan bar Ami. So again, just to review, he says the debate is in public. In private, everyone will agree it's okay. Beit Shammai, right? Beit Hillel thinks it's okay across the board because they don't think that there's any Marit Ayin issue here at all. They don't think anyone's going to come to the wrong conclusion. It's obvious to them that you're doing it for the dovecote. Beit Shammai, who does think it's Marit Ayin, thinks it in public, not in private. That's Rav Chanan. Thinks in public, you can't do it. In private, you can do it. Ika Amri. Some people, though, however, have a different version of Rav Chanan. Amal Rav Chanan bar Ami. Machloket bereshutei yachid. This is going to be the reverse. The debate between them is in private. To Beit Shammai, eat luhu de Rav Yehuda Amarav. Now it's going to be the opposite. Beit Shammai specifically says you can't do it not in private and not in public, and also not in private because he holds like Rav. Anything that's forbidden in public is also forbidden in private. Beit Hillel late lehu de Rav Yehuda Amarav. And Beit Hillel say, okay, let me just finish one more line. If the machloket is in private, then everyone's going to agree in public it's a problem. Beit Hillel just says, well, in public it's a problem, but in private we're going to allow it. And Beit Shammai says, we're not going to allow it anywhere because of what Rav said. What's the problem this time? The problem now is really in Rav Chanan's explanation of Beit Hillel, because according to Beit Hillel doesn't hold by what Rav says. Now, it's a little tricky. Beit Hillel lived before Rav. So what it really means is that Rav doesn't hold like Beit Hillel, and that's strange. It seems like Rav is holding like Beit Shammai, which doesn't make any sense, and that's the Gemara's question here. Lema Rav damal ke Beit Shammai. So if there's this machloket, and Beit Shammai holds whatever's forbidden in private in public is also going to be forbidden in private, and Beit Hillel holds no, we forbid it in public, but we don't forbid it in private. Then basically, when Rav comes along and says whatever is forbidden in public, we're going to also forbid in private, he seems to be holding like Beit Shammai, which doesn't make sense because we always hold like Beit Hillel. So that's the Gemara's question according to this version. To which the Gemara answers, the words are almost identical here. It's just, what does this mean? And this is another case, what we saw earlier in the daf, I said, where the Gemara kind of doesn't tell you the second line, which is really important to understanding it here also. It's a little bit, again, once the Gemara doesn't do that, it's open to different interpretations. But again, I'll go with one interpretation here. Tinaihi. It's a machloket Tanaim, and they're going to quote exactly as they did in the first version, the same machloket, Titania, Shotcham b'chama v'lo keneged ha'am, Rabbi Elazar v'Rabbi Shimon osrim. Okay, that's it. So what does this mean? What this means is that Rav Chanan bar Ami and Rav, the way they understand Beit Hillel's opinion breaks down into how they read that other machloket, right? Who they hold by. So let's explain it in detail. Rav Chanan, you can look at the chart if you want. So when it says, right, the opinion, Shotcham b'chama v'lo keneged ha'am, meaning it's fine if you do it in private. That's the way Rav Chanan bar Ami understands Beit Hillel. It's okay if you do it in private, right? So therefore, again, let's go back to this opinion. According to Rav Chanan in the second reading, in Rishut Rabim, everyone agrees in public, it's forbidden. And the debate is, do we also forbid it in the private domain or not? And we're going to say Beit Hillel doesn't forbid it because Rav Chanan bar Ami holds like the Tana who says you can hang out your laundry in the sun as long, your wet clothes, not your laundry. Hang out your wet clothes from the rain in the sun as long as nobody sees, okay? Because he doesn't think it's a problem. Okay, now here comes the jump, and this is what the Gemara didn't tell you and why it's a little bit more complicated because the Gemara didn't spell this out. But what you'd have to say here, our big question was Rav. How does Rav read the sugya? He must read it differently than Rav Hanan, because Rav wouldn't be holding like Beit Shammai, right? According to Rav Hanan, Beit Shammai is the one who says anything that's forbidden in public is also forbidden in private. Since he can't hold that way, because we assume Rav didn't hold like Beit Shammai, we're going to have to explain Beit Hillel in a way that Rav would make sense. So instead of saying, now, before I even get to the answer, I'm just going to set it up for you. According to the first reading of Rav Hanan, the debate's in public, but in private, everyone agrees it's allowed. According to the second opinion of Rav Hanan, the debate's in private, but in public, everyone agrees it's forbidden. In other words, each time Rav Hanan says the debate's only in one or the other, comes Rav, and he's going to read this again. It doesn't say this in the Gemara, but you'd have to assume, or at least according to some of the commentaries, this is the way to read it, that according to Rav, Beit Hillel, who permits public and private, and Beit Shammai, who forbids public and private, meaning it's not one of these machloket in this case, but everyone agrees in that case. They don't agree about either case, because in order to explain, right, Beit Shammai will very easily hold what? Okay, let's just spell it out. According to Rav, Beit Shammai holds it's forbidden in public because of Marat Ayin, and therefore it's also forbidden in private because that's Rav's whole approach, right? If it's forbidden in public, it's going to be forbidden in private. How will he explain Beit Hillel who permits it in private? It must be he permits it in public as well. And therefore, we're going to say, what's the reason for Beit Hillel? Well, then it goes back to what we said earlier. Why does he permit it? Because remember, the first reading of Rav Hanan was that Beit Hillel permits it across the board. It's Beit Shammai who differentiates. In this case, no one differentiates. Everyone's either entirely permitted or entirely forbidden. And why is that? So Beit Shammai holds Marat Ayin, and therefore also in private. And Beit Hillel holds Shovachom Mochiach Alav. There's no Marat Ayin issue at all. So it's not forbidden in public and it's not forbidden in private. And then it at least doesn't contradict Rav. In other words, Rav can still work within Beit Hillel because Beit Hillel is just not talking about Marat Ayin. So it doesn't raise a question on how can Rav side with Beit Shammai over Beit Hillel. It's not that Rav sides with either one of them. It's that both of them would fit into his theory. Beit Hillel, because he doesn't disagree with the theory, he's not even talking about Marat Ayin, so it has nothing to do with Rav. It's not like it contradicts. Before it contradicted, because Beit Hillel said it's permitted in private, just not in public, and that would contradict Rav. But here it doesn't contradict Rav, it just doesn't have anything to do with Rav. So yes, he's explained Beit Shammai according to his opinion, but that doesn't bother us because if Beit Hillel had talked about Marat Ayin, he would have also worked in with Rav. So that's how we explain it in the end. So according to this, there's basically, we want to summarize the two versions of Rav Hanan bar Ami and the version within the second version of Rav Hanan bar Ami, Rav's reading. We have three readings here of the machloket. One is the machloket in Reshut HaRabim, but in Reshut HaYachid, in private domain, everyone agrees it's allowed. The second is the machlokets in Reshut HaYachid, but in Reshut HaRabim, everyone agrees it's forbidden. And the third is either, right, Beit Hillel permits everything or Beit Shammai forbids everything. And that's Rav's reading according to the second reading of Rav Hanan. In the Gemara's question on him, they explain Rav as saying, holding that way. Okay, so that's one question about what exactly is the machloket about, which is a debate among Emoraim and two different versions of this Emora, what he said, and then that affects, we end up getting to three different ways of understanding the machloket. Now we're going to see, that was Emoraim. Now we're going to talk about Tanaim, who had a different understanding of the machloket than our Mishnah. So the second Amud, today's Ted Amud Bet, starts off with this. Matnitin de lo ki haitan. Our Mishnah clearly has a different version of the machloket Beit Shammai Beit Hillel than this Tana does. This Tana being Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar. Titanya, as it says in a Beitzah, Amar Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar, Modim Beit Shammai u Beit Hillel shemolichim et hasulam mishavach l'shavach. Our Mishnah said the debate is, can you move a ladder from one dovecote to another? Comes Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar, and he says, both of them agree that you can do that. No problem. You need food for Yantif? It's of course allowed. Of course you can move your ladder. How else are you going to get to your dovecotes? How else are you going to get birds? Yes, you can move it. Lo nechlaku ela lahachzir. What's the problem? Can you bring your ladder back? Okay, this is like classic question, a doctor, or let's say you're sick, you go to the hospital, you're allowed to come home, right? So if you're a doctor, we always allow it because otherwise you're not going to go next time, right? We want a pikuach nefesh, so we allow you even to go home, right? When you're a patient, it's more complicated. But without getting into those details now, but the idea being that there's a difference between, right, on your way to do something that's the mitzvah of Simchat Yom Tov and on your way home, right? You've already done the mitzvah. Can you return it to its original place. Beit Shammai omrim em machzirin, uBeit Hillel omrim af machzirin. So the debate is, Beit Shammai says you cannot put it back where it originally was, and Beit Hillel says you can move it back. Amar Rabbi Yehuda. Okay, we're now going to have a few different lines in this Mishnah, in this Beitzah, sorry. And the Gemara, through some stories, we're going to understand better how to read these lines and how they all interface with each other, because there's different ways of reading this. Amar Rabbi Yehuda, Bamed Dvarim Amurim. Rabbi Yehuda comes to now say, well, this, what the Mishnah was just, what Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar said is really only Besulam Shel Shovach. When Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar said that they both agree that you can carry, here we're going to see it inside in the Tannaitic sources about this differentiation. We didn't really see it inside before, about the differentiation between different types of ladders. Okay, we explained it when the Gemara explained Beit Hillel, they said Shovachom Mochiach Halav, which some people explained meant the type of ladder he was using. But here we're going to see it in the Tannaitic source itself, which is Rabbi Yehuda says, this is only that they both agree that you can carry one from dovecote to dovecote is if you have a special ladder designated for dovecotes. Then we're not worried about people suspecting you of anything. Aval b'sulam shel aliyah, but if you take your roof, the one you use to get up to your roof or your second floor of your house, for sure, divrei hakol asul. Rabbi Yehuda comes and says, everyone agrees that that's forbidden. Now the question is, we're going to see this later, Rabbi Yehuda says this about Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar. Is he coming to define Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar, or is he coming to disagree with Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar? Does Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar think that even Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai would agree that to get the birds, you're even allowed to use a ladder from your roof or not? It's not clear. If when Rabbi Yehuda says, Bamed Dvarim Amurim, in what case is he referring to? Is he coming to say, this is what Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar meant? Or is he saying, I disagree with Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar, and this would only be in the case. What he says, he's got a more broad heter about it. I think it would only be in the case of a ladder. So we're going to see that because it's not clear what he means, it led some people to misunderstand. Next line also is unclear. Rabbi Dosa Omer, Matehu mechalon lechalon. He says you can lean it from one window to another, but you can't move it. Right now, the question is again, what's Rabbi Dosa referring to? Remember Rabbi Yehuda, assuming he's referring to Rabbi Yehuda says, this is only in a sulam of a shovach that you're allowed to. And is he coming to be strict and say, no, even a sulam shel shovach, you can only lean from one to the other? Or is he referring to the end of Rabbi Yehuda's statement, which is, bisulam shel aliyah, everyone agrees is forbidden. And he says, well, a sulam shel aliyah, you could actually lean from one window to another. Now, Rabbi Yehuda doesn't think you can use it at all. I think you can lean it. And then he's being more lenient. So again, it's unclear. Is he being more lenient or strict? We don't really know how to understand Rabbi Dosa. And Acherim Omer Mishum Rabbi Dosa, this is just a more broader, including something additional into Rabbi Dosa. This for sure is more lenient than what Rabbi Dosa himself says. Others say that Rabbi Dosa himself meant not only to lean, but af madidimbo. You could even inch it over. Okay, not pick it up and carry it, but you could inch it over from dovecote to dovecote. As long as you're inching, it's okay, right? Moving it a little bit at a time. So now we're going to start to see, we're going to have two versions. It's one of these days with a lot of different versions. Two versions of the sons of Rabbi Chia. And the sons of Rabbi Chia did something. They permitted something. Their father got upset with them when they got home and told him what they did. He got upset and he said, you have to undo what you just did. Okay, good luck with that, right? Especially it was already done, but he got very upset at his sons for misunderstanding this Beitzah. And now the two versions are, which line in the Beitzah did they misunderstand? B'nai Rabbi Chia, right? Classic that we have a story about, we know the basic details. Rabbi Chia's sons permitted something. Rabbi Chia got upset with them. We just don't know what did they permit and what was he upset with them about and what did he hold. B'nai Rabbi Chia nafik l'kiryata. They went out from the city into the fields. And then when they came home, ki'atu, when they got back home, amar lehu avuhon, their father said to them, klum ma'aseh bali etchem, right? Did anything happen today in the fields? Did someone ask you some sort of psak, anything going on? Amru lo sulam bali adenu v'hitirnuhu. Yeah, there was a case of a ladder and we permitted it. Now we don't yet know what happened here, but we'll see in a minute what it was. Amar lahem, he said to them, Tzi'u v'isru ma she'itartem. Go back and forbid what you permitted. You were totally wrong. So now let's see. Inu savor, they thought, Midika Amar Rabbi Yehuda b'sulam shel aliyah lo pligi. Remember, Rabbi Yehuda said, They weren't arguing about a sulam of aliyah. Everyone agrees if you took your sulam from the roof type sulam, like that type of ladder, of course it's forbidden. They thought that since Rabbi Yehuda said that was the case, against Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar, Michlal de Tanakama, the Tanakama here, which was the first Tana, which is Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar, must have held otherwise. Savar pligi. The Tanakama, Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar, when he said, Modim beit Shammai ubeit Hillel shemolichim et hasulam mishovach leshovach, they both agree that you can move it from one to the other. He was talking about even a sulam of the aliyah. Even the wrong type of ladder, they thought it was okay. And Rabbi Yehuda was coming to disagree and said, no, only a sulam of a shavach. So therefore, based on Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar, they permitted carrying a sulam of aliyah to the shavach. So, belohi, they said, but in fact, that's not the case. Rabbi Yehuda, ta'amei de Tanakama kama faresh, came Rabbi Chi, and he said, but you totally misunderstood the Beitzah. When Rabbi Yehuda says, Bamed dvarim amurim, he was coming to say, I'm explaining Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar, who wasn't clear enough about what he meant. This is really what he meant, and he doesn't disagree. He's just explaining what Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar, and Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar forgot to tell you all the details, and I'm filling in the details, but not that he disagrees with him, and therefore, nobody holds that you can move a sulam of aliyah from one place to another, absolutely from one dovecot to another. Definitely not. Now, here we're going to have further proof for Rabbi Chia's reading of this Beitzah. Mimai, how do we know that this is the case? Midekatane, because it says there, Molichim et hasulam mishovach leshovach. It says from one dovecot to another. Now think about it. If it's a sulam of aliyah, where would you find it? You would likely find it up, leaning up against your house, against your roof. So he says like this: Isa kadatach sulam shel aliyah pligi. If you think it was really the sulam of the roof, Hi molichim et hasulam mishovach leshovach. It shouldn't say you can carry a sulam from shavach to shavach, right? That seems to imply you have one leaning against a dovecot and you moved it to the next dovecot. But it should have said, Molichim et hasulam lishovach mebayale. Should have said you can carry a ladder to a dovecot, not from a dovecot. The from shouldn't matter to us. It should be to a dovecot, meaning from your roof. So therefore, it's unlikely that he was talking about the roof, the ladder from the roof. The wording doesn't match that at all. Now, again, you'd have to explain, right? So therefore he says, elalav, hachi kamar. So since it doesn't say molichim et hasulam lishavach, but it says from shavach to shavach, it must be shel shavach in shel aliyah lo. It must be only a ladder from a dovecot and not a ladder from the aliyah. And that's Rav Chia's proof. What did his sons think? What, they didn't read that properly? They didn't realize that? So idach, what was their misunderstanding? Mi katane sulam shel shavach. Mishovach l'shavach katani, right? So again, this is a question on them. It didn't say l'shovach, it said mishovach l'shavach. So how could they explain that? They say afilu l'kama shovachim. They thought that it meant that you can do it from dovecot to dovecot. In other words, start from your aliyah is what they thought. Start from your roof. Take that ladder and you can go from one to the other. Now, what's the issue? Why would you think you can't go from one to the other? If we're going to permit it for Simcha Yom Tov, maybe we're only going to permit you to go to one and get the birds you need and be done with it. And we're going to see this later. It could be you go to a dovecot and there aren't good birds that have enough meat on them to eat. So what they're saying is we thought what it meant is if you go to one and you don't find good birds, you can move it to the other. And if you don't find there, you can move to the other and you can still move from one to the other. Now, what are the possibilities why you would need it to be especially delineated that you could do this? Number one, we might allow you to move something once and not worry that people are going to think that you're moving this, to fix your roof, but multiple times, maybe not, because there's more likelihood someone will see you. Alternatively, you could say, if we allow you to move it and you don't find birds, and then you don't find birds in the next one, you don't find birds in the next one, in the end, you might end up never finding birds, and then you're going to end up moving this ladder for no reason, and then maybe we won't permit it. The whole reason we're allowing this is because of Simchat Yom Tov. Because we want you to be able to have food and enjoy your meal. But if you're not finding birds, then maybe we're not going to allow you to do this at all. So they thought that's why it said mishavach l'shavach, to teach you could still keep going, because hopefully you'll find birds somewhere else. Okay, and the first way I said it, and we're not so worried if you keep moving it, someone will see. Okay, that's what they thought, but they were wrong. That's not why I used the wording. The wording was really to tell you it can only be a ladder from a shavach and not a ladder that is a roof ladder. Next reading of this story of the Bnei Rabbi Chia. Ika da Amre, some people say, Amrulo, he toy sulam shel aliyah bali yadenu v'hiturnua. There was a case where there was a ladder from a roof. It was leaning up against a dovecote, and they allowed to move it from window to window, right? Where they just moved the top of it. And then again, he said to them, Amar lahem, right? Because the basic details of the story are the same. Forbid what you permitted. So inu savu, they thought, Ma'idika asr tanakama kashara Rabbi Dosa. When Rabbi Dosa says, remember, Rabbi Dosa said, Mateu mechalon lechalon. He thought, the sons of Rabbi Chia thought, that when he said you can lean it from one to the other, he was talking about the sulam of aliyah that Tanakama wouldn't permit. Rabbi Dosa comes to be very permissive. And he says, oh yeah, you can, it's true you can't move it from one to another, this ladder from the roof, but you can lean it from window to window. But it's not true. Rabbi Dosa is being more strict. He's saying, you think a sulam shel aliyah, you can, sulam of shovach, you can move, right? Again, Beit Hillel says you can even return it, and Beit Shammai says you can move from one to the other if you're gone on your way. I only allow lahatot. I don't allow moving even the ladder of a shovach. So therefore, he made them forbid what they had permitted. Again, I don't know exactly how they did that. It might have been too late at that point. Okay, next section of today's daf. Now we're going to start a big sugya that's going to continue to tomorrow, which is that each time we're going to take a different mishnah and say all of these mishnayot that we're going to learn, the upcoming mishnayot, all raise an issue to the first mishnah. In the first mishnah, Beit Shammai was lenient about kisoy hadam. Remember, he allows you to slaughter an animal even though you're going to have to cover the blood on Yantif, right? Remember, he allows all that because of Simchat Yom Tov. He wants you to be able to slaughter animals, and Beit Hillel is strict about it. Doesn't allow it unless you prepare the dirt from beforehand. Now we're going to start, all these are starting with our Mishnah and a whole bunch of other Mishnayot, where even though there's an issue of Simchat Yom Tov at stake, which is the same issue basically, Beit Shammai is going to be strict and Beit Hillel is going to be lenient, like here. Beit Hillel is the lenient opinion. So let's start with our question. Right? We see that Beit Shammai is strict here. It seems like when it comes to a Simchat Yom Tov issue, Beit Shammai doesn't care. They're going to be strict about it and not allow you to do things just so that you can get birds on Yom Tov to eat. And Beit Hillel is more lenient. Urimini, and this contradicts. Right? You can dig with your shovel and cover. So each time we're going to have this question based on a different Mishnah that we're going to see against the first Mishnah. Comes Rabbi Yochanan, he's going to say this across the board. Amar Rabbi Yochanan muchlefet hashita. The first Mishnah should be reversed. It's not one of which we thought originally, one of the cases where Beit Shammai is lenient and Beit Hillel is machmir. No, actually, it's Beit Shammai who forbids the slaughtering of the animal if you don't have the dirt ready from before, and Beit Hillel permits it. Just switch the approaches. To which each time Rabbi Yochanan is going to say this, the Gemara is going to say, not necessarily we can differentiate between the cases. So mimai, from where do you get this? Dilma ad kan lo ka'ama, you don't have, it's always a last resort to say, oh, there was a mistake in how it was passed down to us and you flip the names. No, it's always a last resort. So the Gemara is going to say, I have a better answer. Dilma ad kan lo ka'ama Beit Shammai hatam ela hechadi ikadeker na'utz. Remember we saw this, that maybe Beit Shammai only permits it when there's already a shovel in the ground. And then there's less of a halachic issue there. Aval hecha deleka deker na'utz, lo. But if you didn't have that somewhat prepared for beforehand, then we're not going to allow it like our case of the dovecotes. V'inami, and now that only resolves Beit Shammai. Why Beit Shammai was lenient there and strict here. But what about Beit Hillel? Why were they strict there and lenient here? So you'd have to say, Inami ad kan lo ka'amar Beit Hillel hacha ela deshavachom uchiach alav. Remember, we said before, this isn't even an issue to Beit Hillel because it's clear. There's no marit ayin issue. There's no worry because it's clear from the ladder he's using or from the fact that he's moving it from dovecotes. No one's going to think you're plastering your roof. Aval hatam lo, but you can't say the same thing by the kisoy adam. There's really halachic issues and he doesn't want to permit it. So therefore the Gemara says, since you can easily distinguish the cases, elai kasha ha kasha. But really, that's not such a question because we resolved it. We have a better question from the next Mishnah. Beit Shammai omrim lo yitol elim ken yanami ba'od yom. We're going to learn this more in depth tomorrow. Why this is, I don't want to get into it now, but we'll see it tomorrow. Beit Shammai says, don't take birds from the dovecote. In other words, assuming you've gotten to your dovecote, don't take them, right? Let's say your ladder was there already, or depending on what Beit Shammai actually holds, if he permits it in some way, don't take them unless you already touched the doves from before and knew what they, like that's the way you designate them to not be muktzah. Okay, we'll talk about tomorrow why you actually have to touch them. Beit Hillel is more lenient. It says, you could stand at the bottom and just point and say, I want that one and that one. Those are the two I'm going to use tomorrow. So again, here you see, Beit Shammai is more lenient. And that contradicts us. So again, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, just switch the approaches. Then the Gemara says, we're going to have the same thing each time. There, Beit Shammai only permitted it because you already had the shovel in the ground and you already kind of designated it from before. But if you didn't, they wouldn't allow it. And therefore here, he's going to be strict. Inami, I'm just going to finish, even though we're on tomorrow's daf, just to finish the sentence. Alternatively, he said with the dirt, you needed to designate it from before. You didn't have any designated from before. This is enough of designation to just say, I want this and that. That's designation. What more do you need than that? And it's just a matter of how much you need to designate. Do you need to actually hold it, or do you need to demonstrate with your finger? According to Beit Hillel, it's enough. You demonstrate with your finger. With the kisoy adam, you didn't do anything. That's why he forbids it there. So again, each time we're going to bring another Mishnah, raise this contradiction, and then resolve it in, Rabbi Yochanan is going to say, switch the kisoy adam case. And in the end, we're going to give a different reason as to why these cases are different. With that, we will finish. As I said at the beginning, have a good fast, everyone, and a Gemar Chatima Tova.